The signal dropped 3 registers in the space of a single breath, and I knew before the calibration lenses finished their rotation that this was not turbulence. I had served aboard the Pennants of St. Drusus for 11 years. I had logged over 4,000 fluctuation events across 9 sanctioned translations. I understood the texture of turbulence the way a mason understands stone, through sustained and practiced contact, through repetition that became instinct. Turbulence scattered, turbulence sheared across frequency bands in patterns that were violent but ultimately legible. What I registered in the choir chamber on the 312th day of our passage through the rift shadow lanes was not scattering, it was subsidence. The Astronomican's echo did not weaken, it did not fracture or blur, it sank. The entire signal body descended as though the medium carrying it had deepened without warning, the way a river might suddenly lose its bed and spill into a cavern system no surveyor had mapped. I held the focus array steady with both hands, my fingertips slick against the brass contact plates. The choir behind me maintained their chant. 17 voices locked into the harmonic structure of the Litany of Safe Passage, their combined psychic emission forming a lattice I could feel vibrating through the base of my skull. They had not noticed. Their perception operated at sanctioned depth, and sanctioned depth was precisely calibrated to register the warp's navigable surface, the layer where the Emperor's light cut its corridor through madness. I operated 1 layer lower. That was my function. A choir savant does not merely sing with the others, he monitors the medium itself, the consistency of the immaterial fluid through which the Astronomican signal propagates. It is the difference between reading the words on a page and measuring the paper's thickness, its moisture content, the pressure of the ink. I was a quality assessor of the impossible. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica had invested decades of surgical augmentation and psycho-doctrinal conditioning to produce my capacity for this precise work. On this day, that capacity brought me to the edge of something no catechism had prepared me for. The Lord Captain's order had come through the encrypted Vox channel reserved for priority navigation matters. His voice carried the particular flatness of a man accustomed to issuing commands he did not fully understand, but trusted implicitly in the hierarchy that demanded them. We had been in translation for over 300 standard days. The Cicatrix Maledictum's shadow lanes were not true passages through the Great Rift, they were scar channels, regions where the rift's intensity thinned enough for Geller-equipped vessels to endure passage without immediate dissolution. Thin did not mean safe. It meant survivable for a statistically meaningful percentage of attempts. The Lord Captain wanted reassurance that the Astronomican still burned true beyond the ambient interference, and he wanted it confirmed through direct deep listening verification. Deep listening was a right reserved for emergency distress conditions. It required the choir savant to lower perceptual engagement below the navigable current, to push awareness beneath the working depth of standard warp transit and taste the medium's substrate directly. The procedure existed because in rare circumstances, the Astronomican's signal could be locally occluded by dense warp phenomena while still persisting at deeper propagation layers. Confirming its presence there meant confirming the ship had not drifted beyond the Emperor's reach. The rite was sanctioned. It was documented in 17 volumes of procedural liturgy. It required authorization from the vessel's ranking officer and countersignature from the senior astropathic delegate. Both had been provided. I held the parchment in my hand, the Lord Captain's seal pressed in dark red wax beside the delegate's in silver. Everything was authorized. Everything was correct. I initiated the descent. The choir's voices provided the structural lattice, their combined harmonic acting as a tether while I extended my perception downward through the warp's active layer. The sensation is difficult to articulate for those who have not experienced psychic immersion. The warp's navigable surface feels like weather experienced from inside. Emotional pressure systems, currents of raw sentiment, tidal surges of hunger and fury that the Geller field translates into manageable static. Below that surface, the texture changes. The emotional noise dampens. The predatory intelligences that swarm the upper layers thin out, not because they choose to avoid the depth, but because their substance cannot maintain coherence there. It is like watching bonfire ash rise from flame. At a certain altitude, the heat is gone and the ash simply disperses. I passed through the thinning layer and found myself in a stratum I had touched only twice before in 11 years. Both times during genuine distress events when the Astronomicon had been locally screened by warp storms. Both times I had found the Emperor's signal burning steady beneath the interference, a golden thread running through deep silt, and I had pulled back with the relief of a man finding solid ground after wading through floodwater. This time, the golden thread was there. The Astronomicon burned true, exactly as expected. I could have stopped. The rights requirements were fulfilled, signal integrity confirmed. I should have begun the ascent protocol immediately. But beneath the signal, beneath the layer where even the Astronomicon's light became a thin, attenuated wire of directed will, I felt something else. Stillness. Not the stillness of absence, not the dead calm that follows a storm's passage. This stillness had mass. It had pressure. It sat beneath the navigable warp the way bedrock sits beneath topsoil, except bedrock is passive, inert, geological. This pressure was patient. That is the word my mind supplied, and I have never been able to replace it with anything more precise. Patient. The stillness waited with the absolute composure of something that had never needed to act. I completed the ascent. I disengaged the focus array. I recorded the Astronomicon's signal strength, propagation, clarity, and ambient interference index in the choir's operational log. I signed the entry with my designator and sealed it with the astropathic cipherglyph. I did not record the stillness. I did not record the pressure. I told myself it was residual sensation, a psychic afterimage produced by extended immersion below safe operating depth. I told myself the mind creates phantoms when it operates beyond its designed parameters, just as the eye produces false light when pressed. I told myself this was documented, expected, irrelevant. For 23 minutes, I believed what I told myself. Then the choir completed their post-rite purification chant and filed from the chamber, and I was alone with the monitoring equipment and the low vibration of the ship's Gellerfield generators cycling through the deck plating. And in that quiet, I felt it again. Not through psychic perception, not through the focus lenses or the harmonic lattice. I felt it the way one feels the presence of deep water when standing on a pier at night, not seeing, not hearing, but knowing that beneath the surface, the depth continues far beyond anything the darkness reveals. The fracture had already occurred. I simply had not yet agreed to name it. My life until that point had been structured around certainties I did not question, because questioning them served no functional purpose and would have introduced instability into a system that demanded absolute precision. The warp was chaos. This was the first and final truth of the Scholastia Psychana, drilled into every sanctioned psyker from the moment their abilities manifested and the black ships came to collect them. The Imperium was the reflection of mortal emotion, a boiling, screaming mirror of every fear and desire and hateful impulse that sentient minds projected into the fabric of unreality. Its denizens, the creatures the ignorant called daemons, were concentrations of that reflected emotion, predatory by nature, drawn to psychic resonance the way scavengers are drawn to carrion. Against this chaos stood two pillars: the Emperor's will, manifested as the Astronomicon, and the institutions of mankind that channeled, contained, and directed that will through the apparatus of faith and technology. The Gellerfield was a prayer made into physics. The navigator's third eye was a gene-wrought miracle that perceived the Emperor's light across impossible distance. The astropathic choir was a weapon of coordinated psychic discipline, turning the warp's own nature against itself by imposing harmonic order on emotional anarchy. Every element of my existence reinforced this framework. Morning began with the litany of sanctioned perception, a 7-minute recitation that established the parameters of acceptable warp engagement. My psychic faculties were activated, calibrated, and bounded within doctrinally approved limits before I was permitted to approach the choir chamber. The litany named every permissible sensation. It catalogued every authorized depth. It described, in meticulous detail, the texture of the warp's navigable surface so that any deviation from expected conditions would register immediately as anomaly. I had recited it 11,000 times. I performed my duties within this architecture of certainty, and for 11 years it held. The warp screamed, and I logged the screaming. Daemons battered the Geller field, and I measured the impact vectors and filed reports that contributed to the Astropathic Intelligence Archive's threat assessment matrices. Warp surges distorted local reality, and I calibrated compensation protocols. The choir sang, the navigator steered, the field held, and the penance of St. Drusus continued its long passage through corridors of managed insanity. The deep warp appeared in the choir manuals exactly once, a footnote in the appendix of the Codex Immaterialis, Volume 9, subsection 34, paragraph 7. It described a theoretical stratum beneath the warp's active surface, a substrate hypothesized by early Scholastia scholars as a possible explanation for certain anomalous signal loss events during the Great Crusade era. The footnote concluded with a single sentence: "Subsequent investigation has rendered this hypothesis without operational relevance." I had read that footnote during my training. I had not thought about it in 9 years. Now I could not stop thinking about it. In the days following the deep listening rite, I maintained my duties with the precision expected of my station. I logged fluctuation events. I calibrated the choir's harmonic output. I attended the twice-daily signal integrity briefings with the senior delegate, Astropath Corvinus, who had served aboard black ships longer than I had been alive and whose milky, augmetic-laced eyes saw nothing of the material world, but perceived the warp's currents with a fidelity I had always envied. Corvinus recited doctrine like breathing. Every observation he made was framed within the Imperium's cosmological architecture. Warp turbulence was sin made manifest. Signal loss was the faithful being tested. Demonic contact was the enemy's desperation, proof of their impotence before the Emperor's will. I listened. I agreed. I countersigned his reports. I said nothing about what I had felt beneath the sanctioned layer. Self-censorship was not difficult. The apparatus of compliance is designed to make silence easier than speech. Every report I filed passed through 3 doctrinal review filters before entering the ship's permanent archive. Anomalous language, meaning any terminology not drawn from the approved lexicon of warp phenomena, would trigger automatic flagging and summons for clarification. The system did not merely discourage deviation, it made the mechanical act of deviating more labor-intensive than conformity. To describe what I had perceived would require inventing terminology. Invented terminology would require justification. Justification would require theological review. Theological review would require convening an advisory panel that included the ship's confessor, the inquisitorial attaché, and the senior astropathic delegate. I chose to write, "Signal substrate stable, no actionable anomaly," and moved on with my shift. The cost was small, a single phrase omitted, a single truth withheld. I told myself it was pragmatism, that operational cohesion demanded clean data, that introducing subjective sensation into formal logs would contaminate the record. These were not lies. They were reasons that happened to align perfectly with my desire to avoid confronting what I had felt. On the 319th day, during a scheduled monitoring cycle, I lowered my perception again. I did not intend to. The monitoring cycle required surface depth engagement only, a routine sweep of the warp's active layer to confirm Geller field stability and log ambient psychic pressure. The procedure was as familiar as breathing. I had performed it thousands of times. My hands rested on the contact plates. My awareness spread across the navigable surface in a calibrated fan, and I registered the expected conditions. Emotional turbulence in the moderate range, predatory signatures at standard density, Astronomicon echo within acceptable parameters. Then, as I completed the sweep's terminal arc, my perception dipped. Not by choice, not by mechanical failure. It was as though the surface itself had thinned momentarily, like ice that flexes under distributed weight, and my awareness slipped through a fraction deeper than intended. The stillness was there. It had not moved. It had not changed. It waited with the same incomprehensible patience I had felt during the deep listening rite, and in the half-second of contact before I pulled my awareness back to sanctioned depth, I registered a detail I had missed before. The stillness was not uniform. It had texture, not the chaotic emotional texture of the warp's surface, but something geometric, compressed, as if immense forces had been organized into stable configurations so old that the concept of age became meaningless in describing them. I completed the monitoring cycle. I filed the report. Surface readings only, no anomaly. My hands were shaking when I removed them from the contact plates. I pressed them flat against my thighs and held them there until the tremor passed, counting the seconds by the rhythm of the ship's plasma conduit cycling 3 decks below. The next morning, Navigator Primus Augustine Vale collapsed on the observation deck. I was not present. I learned of it through the encrypted priority channel 40 minutes after it occurred, when Senior Delegate Corvinus summoned me to the Astropathic Operations Center for an emergency briefing. The Operations Center was a narrow chamber buried in the ship's core, its walls lined with psychoreactive panels that registered ambient warp conditions through color shifts. When I arrived, the panels pulsed a deep, unsettled amber. Corvinus stood at the central lectern, his staff gripped in both hands, his expression unreadable behind augmetic lenses and the pale scar tissue of decades of soul binding. Navigator Vielle was dead. He had been performing routine warp observation, a task he had executed without incident for the better part of 2 centuries, and had suffered what the ship's senior chirurgeon classified as acute neurological failure. His third eye, the warp-perceiving organ unique to the Navis Nobilite, had ceased function 7 seconds before his biological death. The chirurgeon's preliminary report attributed the failure to prolonged exposure to the cicatrix maledictum's ambient interference. What the report did not include, because it was transmitted verbally in the operations center and never committed to written record, was the navigator's final utterance. The deck officer who had been present described it to Corvinus, and Corvinus relayed it to me with the careful tonelessness of a man handling volatile material. Navigator Vale had turned from the observation aperture, his third eye already clouding, and had spoken 4 words before his legs failed. 4 words, repeated by the deck officer with obvious reluctance and the specific emphasis of someone who wants to be clear that he is merely reporting, not interpreting. Shadow beneath the light. Corvinus told me this. Then he told me to forget it. His exact words were, "The navigator's terminal vocalization was symptomatic of neurological collapse and holds no interpretive value. You will affirm this if questioned." I affirmed it. The inquisitorial attaché arrived within the hour. His name was Davo. He held no visible rank insignia and wore the plain grey coat of a minor administratum functionary, but every officer aboard the Pennants knew what he was, because every black ship carried one, and their presence was an open secret maintained through the polite fiction of bureaucratic anonymity. Davo sealed the observation deck, collected the chirurgeon's report, interviewed the deck officer, and issued a standing instruction that any further discussion of Navigator Vale's death would be limited to the official medical finding. I was summoned to Davo's quarters the following morning. The room was small, Spartan, and dominated by a writing desk covered in data slates. He offered me recaf. I declined. He asked me to confirm that no anomalous warp signatures had been recorded during the period surrounding Navigator Vale's collapse. I confirmed this because it was technically true. My monitoring equipment had registered nothing abnormal at sanctioned depth. He asked me to sign a formal attestation to that effect. A single sheet of parchment, pre-printed with standardized language declaring that the astropathic choir's instruments had detected no evidence of demonic activity, warp breach, or anomalous psychic phenomena in connection with the incident. I signed it. My stylus moved across the parchment with the steady pressure of practiced compliance, and as the ink dried, I understood that I had done something more consequential than omitting a detail from a monitoring log. I had formally bound my name and authority to a narrative I knew to be incomplete. The navigator had not died from prolonged exposure to the rift. He had seen something from below. His third eye had not burned out from excessive input. It had been occluded, covered, closed from beneath, exactly as he had said, by something rising upward from a depth the official record did not acknowledge. I knew this because I had touched that depth myself. I knew this because the stillness I had felt was precisely the kind of phenomenon that could interact with a navigator's warp site without leaving any signature detectable by standard instruments. It was not demonic. It was not chaotic. It did not register on any scale the Imperium possessed for measuring warp threat, because every scale the Imperium possessed was calibrated for the warp's surface. This was not surface. And I had just signed a document declaring it did not exist. The days that followed compressed into a routine that felt increasingly like performance. I recited the litany of sanctioned perception each morning and heard the words as sounds rather than meaning. I calibrated the choir's harmonic output and monitored the navigable surface and filed reports that described a warp I no longer believed was the whole of what surrounded us. The choir sang. The replacement navigator, a younger woman of the same noble house, took her position at the observation aperture with the rigid posture of someone determined to prove that the post was not cursed. The Geller field cycled steadily. The penance of St. Drusus continued its passage through the rift shadow lane. On the 329th day, the warp attacked. The assault came without the gradual pressure build that typically preceded demonic incursion. One moment, the ambient readings held within normal parameters. The next, the psycho-reactive panels in the operations center flared a violent, saturated crimson that I had seen only twice in my career, and the ship's hull began to ring. The sound was not metallic. It was organic, a keening that resonated through the superstructure as though the vessel itself had become a tuning fork struck by something vast. The Geller field's output spiked as it compensated for external pressure. Alarm klaxons triggered across every deck. The choir, drilled for this eventuality since their earliest training, immediately shifted from standard harmonic to combat configuration, their voices locking into the aggressive, discordant pattern designed to disrupt daemonic coherence. I took my position at the focus array and extended perception to the sanctioned combat depth, which permitted wider lateral awareness at the cost of reduced vertical sensitivity. The surface of the warp outside the Geller field's boundary was alive with predatory forms. I could feel them pressing against the barrier, dozens of semi-coherent entities drawn by the ship's psychic signature, their hunger a palpable weight against my extended senses. Standard threat, manageable threat. The field held. The choir's combat harmonic shattered the weaker manifestations before they could consolidate. Then I felt it again. Not the entities, not the screaming surface chaos. Below, the stillness. But this time it was not merely present. It was active. Active is not quite right. It did not move the way the surface entities moved, with direction and hunger and purpose. It shifted the way a geological fault shifts, not because it intends to, but because accumulated pressure reaches a threshold that physics will not deny. Something in the deep adjusted, and the effect on the surface was immediate. The demonic entities stopped pressing against the Geller field. They stopped because they were no longer there. I watched through extended perception as the predatory forms that had been battering the ship's barrier were pulled downward, not repelled, not destroyed, pulled, as if the surface they occupied had suddenly developed a gradient that their substance could not resist. They unraveled as they descended, their coherence shredding like fabric caught in machinery, their emotional signatures dissipating into something I could not follow because it passed below my sanctioned perception range. The Geller field flickered, not from breach, not from impact, but from resonance interference. The field was calibrated to counter pressure from the warp's active layer. The pull from below created a harmonic mismatch that the field's emitters had not been designed to compensate for. For 3 seconds, the field's output oscillated wildly, and I felt the raw warp brush against the ship's hull without mediation. Then the oscillation corrected. The field stabilized, the surface entities were gone, pulled into the depth. The ambient readings dropped to levels I had never seen during a mid-rift translation, cleaner than real space proximity readings. As though the warp around us had been scoured, the choir fell silent by reflex. 17 voices stopped simultaneously, not because they had received an order, but because the combat harmonic had nothing left to combat. I could feel their confusion through the residual lattice, a collective dissonance that tasted of copper and cold stone. The all clear sounded 9 minutes later. The Lord Captain's voice on the shipwide vox carried the measured satisfaction of a commander whose vessel had weathered a storm. He commended the crew. He praised the Emperor's protection. He instructed all departments to file post-engagement reports within the standard 4-hour window. I filed mine. Demonic assault of moderate intensity, duration 8 minutes, terminated by Geller field stabilization and choir combat harmonic. No breach. No casualties, no anomalies. The ship survived unscathed. Too unscathed. That phrase entered my mind and would not leave. Warp engagements of that intensity always left marks. Hull stress indicators should have shown microfractures in the field-adjacent plating. Psychic residue should have contaminated the outer compartments, requiring purification cycles. At least 1 or 2 of the weaker choir members should have reported symptomatic backlash, nosebleeds and migraines, and minor perceptual disturbances that were the normal cost of combat harmonic deployment. Nothing. Clean bulkheads, clean instruments, clean minds. As if the attack had never progressed far enough to leave evidence, because something else had intervened before the damage could accumulate. I said nothing. But that night, in the narrow cot of my quarters with the lights extinguished and the deck plating humming its endless monotone beneath me, I made a decision that I understood even then was irreversible. I would lower my perception during the next monitoring cycle, deliberately, past the sanctioned boundary, and I would hold it there long enough to properly observe what existed below. This was not curiosity. Curiosity implies a detached, intellectual interest in discovery. What I felt was the grinding, unavoidable pressure of a man who has seen water rising beneath a sealed door and knows that not looking will not stop the flooding. The depth existed. It interacted with the warp's surface in ways that affected my ship, my choir, and my operational reality. Ignoring it was not caution. It was the specific kind of ignorance that gets people killed while they congratulate themselves on following procedure. I told myself this. I told myself it was operational necessity. It was also transgression, and I knew it. The next scheduled monitoring cycle fell on the 331st day. I prepared with meticulous care, arriving at the choir chamber an hour before the cycle began to inspect the focus array personally. The chamber was empty at that hour, the choir not yet assembled for their pre-cycle devotions. The room was hexagonal, 15 meters across, with a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into shadow above the range of the bioluminescent strips embedded in the walls. The focus array dominated the center, a complex arrangement of psycho-conductive crystals mounted in a brass armature that could be adjusted to direct and concentrate a savant's perception like a lens focuses light. Around the array, 17 kneeling stations were arranged in a circle, each equipped with harmonic resonance plates that amplified the individual choir members' output into the collective lattice. I adjusted the focus array's vertical axis by 2 degrees, a small change. It shifted the array's optimal perception range fractionally lower, enough to extend my awareness without requiring conscious effort that might register as anomalous to the choir members monitoring the lattice's stability. It was the kind of technical modification that fell within my authority as choir savant, a calibration adjustment that required no countersignature and generated no automatic log entry. The choir assembled. The pre-cycle devotions were recited. The monitoring cycle began. I descended. The navigable surface parted around my awareness with its familiar texture of screaming emotion and predatory hunger, and I sank below it as smoothly as a weighted line sinks through water. The transition zone between the surface and the deeper strata felt different this time, thinner, as though repeated contact had worn the boundary the way a path wears through undergrowth. I passed through the thinning layer where demonic coherence failed and into the quiet below. A fluctuation in the monitoring cycle's rhythm compressed my decision window. The choir's harmonic shifted as one of the junior members adjusted her resonance plate, and the resulting ripple through the lattice created a momentary widening of my perceptual aperture. I had seconds. If I pulled back, the aperture would close and the cycle would continue normally. If I pushed deeper, I would be operating beyond any recoverable parameter. I pushed. The deep warp opened beneath me like a held breath finally released. It was not empty. It was not dark, because darkness is a condition of light's absence, and light was not a relevant concept at this depth. It was not silent, because silence is defined by the potential for sound, and the dimension I now perceived operated in registers that made the concept of vibration irrelevant. What it was, with a clarity that burned itself into my comprehension like a brand into flesh, was structured. Immense geometric pressures arranged in configurations so old that the warp's screaming surface, its gods and daemons and 10,000-year wars, registered as nothing more than foam on the surface of an ocean whose floor I could not perceive. The structures were not static. They held tension, the way a suspension bridge holds tension. Every element under load, every force balanced against its opposite, in a state of equilibrium that predated the existence of the species whose emotions had formed the turbulent surface above. And the structures were indifferent. I do not mean they chose indifference. I do not mean they had decided that the warp's surface phenomena, or the material universe beyond it, were unworthy of attention. I mean that the concept of attention did not apply. The deep warp did not notice the ruinous powers for the same reason the ocean floor does not notice the wind. The scale differential was absolute. The screaming gods were weather. The Astronomicon was a candle. And below everything that humanity had ever feared, fought, worshipped, or died screaming about in the Imperium, this vast and patient architecture continued its incomprehensible existence in total structural silence. The Emperor's light did not reach it, not because it was blocked, not because it was consumed. The light simply did not apply. It was a signal broadcast in a medium that this depth did not share. The Astronomicon burned in the warp's active layer like a torch burns in air, and the deep warp existed in a substrate where fire had no meaning. I remained in contact for 11 seconds. It might have been 11 years. Time behaved differently there. Not distorted, as the warp's surface distorts time through emotional interference. Irrelevant. Time was a property of systems that changed, and the deep warp showed no evidence of change on any scale I could perceive. The structures I felt had achieved a state of equilibrium that made the concept of duration meaningless. They did not persist through time, They existed in a condition where time was not a relevant dimension. I pulled back. The ascent felt like tearing free of gravity, not because the depth resisted, but because my own perception had begun to acclimate to its pressure, and returning to the shallow, screaming chaos of the navigable warp felt like emerging from deep water into a windstorm. The contrast was physically painful. I gasped aloud, and the nearest choir member turned toward me with a frown of concern that I waved away with a gesture I hoped appeared controlled. My hands were shaking again. This time the tremor did not stop when I pressed them against my thighs. It migrated into my forearms, then my shoulders, then settled into a low, persistent vibration in the muscles of my jaw that made my teeth click together at irregular intervals. A physical response to psychic contact that exceeded my body's designed tolerance. I completed the monitoring cycle. I filed the report. Surface readings only, no anomaly. In my quarters afterward, I sat on the edge of my cot and stared at the bare metal wall and tried to reconcile what I had perceived with the doctrinal framework that had given my life its shape and purpose. The warp was chaos. The warp was a reflection of mortal emotion. The warp's dangers were reflections of humanity's sins, and they could be combated through purity, faith, and the Emperor's divine will. The deep warp was none of these things. It was not chaos. It was structured beyond any architecture the Imperium had ever conceived. It was not a reflection of anything human, because it had existed before humanity and would exist after humanity with the same incomprehensible patience it displayed now. It was not dangerous in any way the Imperium's defenses were designed to address, because it was not hostile. Hostility requires engagement. The deep warp was disengaged from everything above it with a completeness that rendered the concept of threat irrelevant. The ruinous powers, the four great enemies of mankind, the cosmic horrors that had consumed civilizations and damned worlds and driven entire species to extinction over millennia of supernatural war, were surface phenomena. They were the froth. They raged and devoured and corrupted, and beneath them the deep warp continued as it always had, unchanged, unmoved, uncaring. The daemons I had spent 11 years monitoring, measuring, and defending against were not the deepest horror of the Imperium. They were the shallowest. The tremor in my jaw persisted for 3 days. On the second day, I noticed that the choir's monitoring instruments had registered a subtle alteration in my psychic signature, a shift in the baseline frequency that identified my individual resonance within the collective lattice. The change was minor, within acceptable variance parameters, but I noted it with clinical detachment because I understood its cause. Extended contact with the deep warp had altered the way my psychic faculties interfaced with the Imperium. The shift was like the difference between an eye that has only seen daylight and an eye that has perceived total darkness. The pupil does not fully contract again. I could not revert to prior perceptual limitations. The depth was now a permanent feature of my awareness, a pressure I could sense at the periphery of every monitoring cycle, every litany, every moment of psychic engagement. It was like knowing that the floor beneath my feet was not solid ground, but a platform suspended over an abyss. The platform held. My duties continued, but the knowledge of what waited below changed the meaning of every step. On the 336th day, Astropath Tertia Maran Solke, a junior member of the choir who had served aboard the Penance for 2 years, attempted an unauthorized descent. I do not know how she knew. I do not know if she sensed the alteration in my psychic signature and traced its cause, or if she had independently perceived the depth during the warp assault and drawn her own conclusions, or if some other factor had led her to attempt what she attempted. I knew her only as a competent, quiet young woman with the particular rigidity of bearing that characterized psychers who had been soul-bound late and bore the scars of that tardiness in their posture. She performed the descent during an unsupervised calibration session, using a secondary focus lens that she had adjusted without my knowledge. The choir's monitoring instruments registered her psychic signature dropping below sanctioned depth at 14 minutes past the 4th hour, and by the time I reached the choir chamber, she was seated at her station with her hands resting on her resonance plate, and her eyes open and her mouth slightly parted, and her psychic presence gone. She was breathing. Her pulse was steady. Her pupils responded to light. Every physiological indicator suggested a healthy, functioning human being. But when I extended my perception toward her, I found nothing. Not the blank absence of a null or the distorted void of a pariah. Something worse. An empty vessel. The space where her psychic resonance should have existed, the fundamental harmonic that identified her as a sentient being with a soul, contained only silence. The medical adepts examined her. They found no corruption, no warp taint, no demonic signature, no neurological damage, no evidence of psychic predation as the Imperium understood the term. Her body functioned. Her mind processed sensory input and generated appropriate motor responses. She could walk when directed. She could eat when fed. She could sit when placed in a chair. She could not pray. She could not project. She could not perceive. She could not be perceived. She was a body with the absolute minimum of animating force required to sustain biological function, and nothing more. I sat with her in the isolation ward while the medical adepts completed their assessment. She stared at the wall across from her cot with an expression that was not vacant. Vacancy implies a space that was once filled, but rather settled, as though she had arrived at a condition that required no further adjustment. She spoke once. Her voice was flat, uninflected, stripped of the subtle psychic harmonics that colored every word a psyker uttered. She said, "It does not hate us." I asked her what she meant. She did not respond. She did not speak again. I ordered her sedated and confined to the isolation ward under medical supervision. I filed the incident report using the standardized classification for warp predation anomaly, which was the closest available category to what had actually occurred, and had the significant advantage of not requiring me to describe what I believed had actually happened. What I believed was this: she had descended to the depth, and the depth had not attacked her mind. It had not burned her. It had not corrupted her. It had simply made her irrelevant. Her psychic resonance, the substance of her soul's interaction with the Imperium, had encountered a stratum where that resonance held no significance, and it had dissipated, not consumed. Not suppressed, rendered meaningless. Like a voice speaking into a vacuum, not silenced by force, but erased by the absence of a medium through which sound could travel. The deep warp did not destroy what entered it. It contextualized it into insignificance. I did not sleep that night. My quarters felt smaller than they were, the ceiling lower, the walls closer, and I understood this was not physical but perceptual, the consequence of knowing that the material dimensions I inhabited were themselves a surface phenomenon resting atop something vastly, incomprehensibly deeper. The migraine that had begun during my own descent had not abated. It lived behind my eyes like a second pulse, and my hands maintained their tremor at a frequency too subtle to see but persistent enough to feel when I pressed my fingertips together. In the days following Marin Solke's hollowing, the choir's cohesion deteriorated, not dramatically, not in ways that would trigger formal intervention, but I could feel it in the lattice during monitoring cycles, a subtle disharmony that tasted like tarnished silver. The other choir members had not been told the details of Solke's condition, but they knew she was gone, and they knew the official classification did not satisfy. Psychers are sensitive to unspoken tension. It colors the air like humidity. I could have addressed it. A choir savant's duties include maintaining the choir's psychological stability during extended translations. I could have convened a doctrinal reassurance session, brought in the ship's confessor, reinforced the catechism that explained warp predation as the enemy's impotent grasping against the Emperor's faithful. I chose not to, because every word of that catechism now rang hollow in my own perception, and I did not trust myself to recite comfort I no longer believed. Instead, I increased the monitoring cycle frequency and filed the requisite paperwork justifying the change as a precautionary response to the predation event. Procedure substituted for faith. It was, I found, a remarkably effective replacement. The choir responded to increased structure the way soldiers respond to drill when morale falters, drawing stability from action rather than belief. Attaché Darvo began appearing at my briefings. He did not announce himself. He did not request attendance. He simply materialized at the rear of the operations center during the morning signal integrity review, his gray coat blending with the metal walls, his expression one of polite attention. The first time, I assumed it was related to Salk's incident. The second time, I realized it was broader than that. He was reading my reports. Not the formal entries in the ship's archive. Those were filtered through 3 doctrinal review layers and contained nothing that would attract attention. He was reading the raw data streams from the choir's monitoring instruments, the unprocessed numbers that preceded my interpretive summaries. He was looking at the gap between what the instruments recorded and what my reports described. The gap was small, but it existed because I had been unconsciously modulating my reports to exclude readings that originated from perception depths I had not officially been operating at. The raw data showed fluctuations that my summaries did not account for, minor discrepancies that an average auditor would dismiss as calibration drift, but that an inquisitorial analyst would recognize as evidence of unauthorized operational parameters. Surveillance replaced routine. I began noticing things. Data slates on my desk repositioned by millimeters. My personal logs accessed timestamps showing entries at hours I had been asleep. The medical adept assigned to my quarterly physiological review spending 40 minutes on a procedure that normally took 15, with particular attention to the neurological response matrices that would reveal sustained deep warp contact. I altered my report phrasing. I excised any terminology that could be construed as referencing subsurface phenomena. I replaced depth with density. I replaced beneath with peripheral. I replaced stillness with interference null zone. The language of concealment became a second fluency, practiced with the same precision I applied to the litany of sanctioned perception. I was codifying self-censorship into professional habit, and I understood that this was exactly what the system required. Not truth, not accuracy, compliance. The Imperium did not need its instruments to perceive reality. It needed them to perceive doctrine. The warp surged again on the 341st day, smaller than the first assault. The choir shifted to combat configuration with practiced efficiency, and I took my position at the focus array and extended perception to combat depth. The daemonic entities came. They battered the Geller field with the mindless hunger that characterized minor warp predators, semi-coherent manifestations of emotional excess that the field's blessed circuits disrupted on contact. The choir sang their discordant combat harmonic. The entities shattered. Then the deeper ones arrived, more coherent, more purposeful, pressing against the field with coordinated malice that suggested a directing intelligence behind the swarm. The Geller field's output climbed. The choir strained. I felt the lattice flexing under the load, felt the individual voices within it wavering as fatigue accumulated. And then, as before, the pull came from below. The coherent demons resisted longer than the minor ones had. I watched through extended perception as they struggled against the downward gradient, their forms stretching, distorting, fragmenting as something beneath the surface drew them in. One of the larger entities, a thing of molten rage and barbed hunger that had been pressing against the field with enough force to make the hull plating groan, came apart over the space of 6 seconds. Its substance unraveled from the bottom up, drawn downward in streamers of dissipating psychic matter that thinned and vanished below my perception's range. The field flickered again, the same resonance interference, the same harmonic mismatch between the field's calibrated output and the pull from the depth. This time it lasted 5 seconds, and during those 5 seconds the raw warp pressed against the hull and I felt the screaming chaos of the surface layer directly, unmediated, and it felt shallow. That was the word. Shallow. The surface warp, the seething ocean of madness that had defined humanity's relationship with the Imperium since before the Emperor's ascension, felt like a puddle. A thin, noisy film of turbulence stretched over something so deep that the turbulence became irrelevant by comparison. I did not alert command. I watched the demonic entities vanish into the depth and I said nothing. Because what would I have said? That the ship had been saved by something I was not authorized to perceive? That the Geller field's survival was due not to its own integrity but to an intervention from a stratum the Imperium's entire cosmological framework denied? That the screaming horrors of the warp were, at this very moment, being swallowed by something that treated them with the same indifference they showed toward the insects that infested the ship's lower decks? I said nothing. The all clear sounded. The reports were filed. Another engagement survived. Another prayer of thanks offered to the Emperor, whose light, I now understood, did not extend to the level where the actual protection had originated. By choosing silence, I had become complicit in the Imperium's institutional misclassification of events I had witnessed directly. This was not passive omission. This was active participation in the maintenance of a false cosmological framework. I understood this. I accepted it, because the alternative, reporting what I knew, would not illuminate. It would destroy. The doctrine that the warp is chaos, that its dangers are reflections of human sin, that faith and the Emperor's will are sufficient armor against the Imperium's horrors. This doctrine was the load-bearing wall of the Imperium's spiritual architecture. Remove it, and the structure collapses. The deep warp could not be fought with faith. It could not be navigated with the Astronomicon. It could not be contained by Geller fields. It existed outside every parameter the Imperium used to define, measure, and combat the warp's dangers. To acknowledge it was, to acknowledge that humanity's 10,000-year war against chaos was a war fought on a surface, and that the surface was the least significant layer of the battleground. I was protecting the Imperium from a truth it could not survive. I told myself this. And it was true. And it was also the most convenient possible justification for cowardice. On the 345th day, I made my final descent. I did not adjust the focus array. I did not wait for a monitoring cycle. I entered the choir chamber during the third shift rest period, when the room was empty and the instruments were in standby mode, and I sat at my station and placed my hands on the contact plates and lowered my perception without tether, without lattice, without the choir's harmonic to serve as anchor. I descended through the navigable surface, through the thinning layer, through the quiet zone where demonic coherence failed, into the substrate. I went deeper than I had gone before. I went deeper than I had believed possible. The geometric structures I had previously perceived at the edge of comprehension now surrounded me, above and below and on every side, configurations of compressed force arranged in patterns that my mind could not process as shapes, but recognized as architecture. Not built, not constructed, existing. The way mathematics exists, not because someone created it, but because its relationships are inherent in the structure of logic itself. The deep warp was not a place beneath the warp, it was the foundation of it. The screaming, chaotic surface was not the warp's true nature, any more than waves are the ocean's true nature. Waves are what happens when energy disturbs a surface. The ocean's true nature is depth and pressure and silence, and it continues with or without waves, indifferent to the storms that rage above it. The chaos gods, the ruinous powers, the great enemies of mankind, were storms. They were patterns of disturbance in the warp's surface layer, generated by the emotional output of sentient species over millions of years. They were real. They were dangerous. They were also, in the context of the deep warp, unimaginably superficial. They raged and plotted and warred and devoured, and the foundation beneath them did not register their existence. The Emperor's light burned in the upper layer like a signal fire on a cliff above the sea. It reached those who stood on the surface. It guided those who navigated the waves. It did not penetrate the water. It could not. The Astronomicon was broadcast in a medium that the deep warp did not share, like a radio signal transmitted into stone. I remained in the depth for a duration I could not measure. Time had lost application. The structures around me existed in a state that predated temporal sequence, a condition of equilibrium so fundamental that the concept of change had no purchase. If these structures had an origin, it preceded the universe. If they had a purpose, it was expressed in dimensions I could not access. They waited, but waiting implies anticipation, and anticipation implies a future state. And the deep warp showed no evidence of operating in a temporal framework where future states were distinct from present states. It was older than the gods. I use that phrase because it is the closest approximation my mind could produce, but it is inaccurate. The gods were recent. The gods were young. The gods were the product of a specific set of conditions, sentient species generating emotional output into a reactive medium, and they had risen and would eventually fall as those conditions changed. The deep warp was not older than the gods, the way a mountain is older than a city. It was older the way bedrock is older than weather. It existed in a category that made the comparison meaningless, and it did not notice the gods, and it did not notice the Emperor, and it did not notice me. That was the final revelation, the one that fractured something inside me that I have never been able to repair. I hung in the deep warp's immense, structured silence, a single sentient point of psychic awareness, surrounded by compressed geometries of incomprehensible age, and I was not perceived, not ignored, not deemed unworthy of attention, simply unperceived. The way a bacterium on the ocean floor is unperceived by the tectonic plate it rests upon, not because the plate is hostile, not because the plate is merciful, because the scale differential renders the concept of perception inapplicable. I was irrelevant. Humanity was irrelevant. The screaming gods, the eternal war, the Emperor on his golden throne holding back the darkness with 10,000 years of agony, all of it occurred on a surface that the deep warp did not register. We were noise. Thin, temporary, self-important noise, raging above an abyss that would continue in perfect, structural silence long after the last sentient mind had flickered and gone dark. I ascended. The return to the navigable surface felt like being born into a scream. The warp's chaos crashed over my perception with its familiar fury, and I welcomed it because fury at least acknowledged my existence. The daemons that swam in the upper tides were horrible, but they saw me. They hungered for me. They hated me with a passion that was, in its way, a form of recognition. The deep warp offered no such recognition. It offered nothing. That was its horror. In the days that followed, I attempted to find precedent. The penance of St. Drusus, as a black ship of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, carried an extensive archive of astropathic and navigational records spanning centuries of warp transit. The archive was housed in a sealed vault amidships, accessible only to authorized astropathic personnel, and I had the necessary clearances to access its contents for operational purposes. I spent every off-duty hour in the archive for 7 consecutive days. The records were stored on data crystal matrices organized by date, vessel, and transit route, hundreds of thousands of individual entries covering centuries of travel through the Imperium. I was not searching for the deep warp by name, because the deep warp had no name in the Imperium's official lexicon. I was searching for the symptoms of its existence: unexplained signal loss, anomalous navigator reports, astropathic blank events, and Jella field resonance disturbances that did not correlate with demonic activity. I found them, not one or two, hundreds. Scattered across centuries, logged by different hands on different ships in different sectors, each one individually too minor to attract attention, and collectively forming a pattern so clear that its invisibility could only be institutional. Ships lost without warp breach, their Geller fields intact, their crews simply gone, classified as navigational error. Astropaths rendered blank, their souls emptied without corruption, classified as warp predation of unknown type. Navigators reporting deep shadow or rising occlusion or floor currents before being executed for instability or retired for psychological degradation. Geller field disturbances originating from below the active layer, classified as calibration drift or resonance feedback. Every incident had been individually explained, every explanation was plausible within doctrine, and every explanation was wrong. The institutional response was consistent across centuries and sectors. When an event could not be attributed to demonic activity, warp turbulence, or human error, it was reclassified into the nearest available category. The category did not need to be accurate, it needed to be doctrinally compliant. A navigator who reported something beneath the current was not investigated for the nature of that something. He was assessed for psychological stability and, when found wanting, removed from service. An astropath who emerged from transit with diminished perception was not examined for the cause of that diminishment. She was classified as warp damaged and reassigned to menial signal work. The bureaucracy did not suppress the deep warp through conspiracy, it suppressed the deep warp through categorization. Every observation that did not fit the Imperium's cosmological framework was translated into language that did fit, and the translation erased the observation's meaning as surely as burning the original document would have. The archive was not missing records. It was full of records that had been doctrinally neutered, their anomalous content smoothed into compliance by the simple act of filing them under the wrong heading. I sat in the archive vault on the seventh night and understood the pattern with a clarity that felt like physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. The Imperium had encountered the deep warp repeatedly across its entire history. It had categorized these encounters incorrectly every time, and it had done so not because the information was unavailable, but because the information was incompatible with the single most important article of Imperial faith: that the warp's dangers are a reflection of humanity, and that the Emperor's will is the ultimate authority within the Imperium. If the warp's surface chaos was a reflection of mortal emotion, then it could be fought through purity. Faith had meaning. The Emperor's sacrifice had purpose. The Imperium's 10,000-year struggle against chaos was a war that could, theoretically, be won. If there existed a layer of the warp untouched by humanity, a pre-human abyss of structured indifference that rendered the chaos gods as superficial as wind patterns, then the Imperium's entire cosmological framework fractured. Faith did not reach the deep warp. Purity was irrelevant to it. The Emperor's light did not penetrate it. And the war against chaos was not a cosmic battle for the soul of the galaxy. It was a border skirmish fought on a surface, while the true nature of the Imperium continued beneath, unaffected and unaware. The Imperium could not survive that knowledge. I understood now why the archive was full of misclassified records. Not because the bureaucrats who filed them were stupid or corrupt. Because they were correct. The suppression of the deep warp was not an institutional failure. It was an institutional success. The Imperium's cosmological framework held because it was protected by the same mechanism that protected every load-bearing wall. You did not remove it, even if you knew it was built on incomplete foundations, because removing it would bring down the structure it supported. The deep warp was not suppressed because it was false. It was suppressed because it was true, and the truth was architecturally incompatible with survival. I closed the archive. I returned to my quarters. I sat on the edge of my cot and stared at the wall and felt the migraine pulse behind my eyes and the tremor vibrate in my jaw, and the pressure of the deep settled over me like silt settling on an ocean floor. I had no one to tell. This was not a matter of secrecy or fear, though both were present. It was a matter of structural impossibility. The language I would need to describe what I had perceived did not exist in the Imperium's lexicon. The conceptual framework required to understand it did not exist in the Imperium's theology. I could have stood on the ship's bridge and spoken every word of what I knew, and it would have been received as gibberish, because the listeners lacked the perceptual foundation to process it. The junior members of the choir had already distanced themselves. Marin Sulky's hollowing had frightened them, and my subsequent behavior, the increased monitoring, the altered report language, the long hours in the archive, had generated a quiet unease that expressed itself as avoidance. They fulfilled their duties. They maintained the harmonic. They did not seek my company. Corvinus, the senior delegate, continued his duties with the impermeable certainty of a man whose faith was structural rather than examined. He recited doctrine with the same inflection he had used for decades. I envied him, not his faith, which I now understood as a beautiful and necessary blindness, but his capacity to function without perceiving the foundation beneath the foundation. He operated on the surface, and the surface was sufficient for his duties and his peace. I had lost the ability to perceive only the surface. The deep warp was present in every monitoring cycle, every litany, every moment of psychic engagement. It did not intrude. It did not call. It simply existed, a constant pressure at the bottom of my awareness, like the knowledge of one's own skeleton. You cannot unfeel your bones once you have become aware of them. I stopped seeking validation. Understanding became a burden I carried alone, not because I chose solitude, but because solitude was the inevitable consequence of perceiving a truth that existed outside the shared framework of everyone around me. I could not explain it. I could not share it. I could only know it, and knowing it without the possibility of communication transformed the knowledge from a discovery into a prison. It was the memory that hurt most, not the archive records or the pattern recognition or the intellectual comprehension of institutional suppression. The memory. I found myself reinterpreting every prior warp encounter through the lens of what I now understood, and the reinterpretation stripped those encounters of the meaning I had assigned them at the time. The demonic assaults I had weathered with fear and faith became shallow. The warp storms I had endured with gritted teeth and white-knuckled compliance became surface noise. The moments of genuine terror, the times I had felt the Imperium's malice pressing against my mind and had held fast through prayer and discipline, became performances, not false, but incomplete. I had been afraid of the wrong thing. I had fought the wrong enemy. I had spent 11 years defending against waves while standing on a platform suspended over an abyss I had not known existed. My faith had been real. My courage had been real. My service had been real. And all of it had been directed at a layer of reality so superficial that the true depths did not register its existence. I mourned my former faith the way one mourns a person who is not dead but simply gone, present in memory but absent in fact, still real but no longer accessible. I could remember what it felt like to believe that the Emperor's light was the ultimate authority in the Imperium. I could remember the comfort of knowing that the warp's horrors were reflections of human sin and could therefore be combated through human virtue. I could remember the stability of a cosmological framework where danger had meaning and resistance had purpose, and survival was a testament to divine protection. I could remember all of this. I could not return to it. The hierarchy of horror had been revealed, and knowledge does not have a reverse function. The Astronomicon still burned. The Emperor still endured. The Imperium still fought its endless war against the ruinous powers. None of that had changed. What had changed was the scale of the context in which those facts existed. The Emperor's light was real, and it did not reach the deep warp. The Imperium's war was real, and it was fought on a surface. The Chaos Gods were real, and they were superficial. My identity as a guardian of signal integrity became hollow. I had spent my career ensuring the Astronomican's echo remained clear and stable during warp transit, treating this as a sacred duty, a contribution to mankind's survival. I still performed the duty. I still maintained the signal, but I now understood that the signal operated in a layer of the immaterium so thin, so shallow, so inconsequential relative to what lay beneath it, that my role was equivalent to ensuring the quality of a message painted on the surface of water. The message was real. The recipients needed it, but the ocean beneath it continued regardless of what was written above. Attaché Darvo summoned me on the 354th day. The summons arrived via handwritten note delivered by a ship's rating who had clearly been selected for his illiteracy, a common practice when inquisitorial personnel wished to ensure the messenger could not read the message. The note was brief. I was to present myself at Darvo's quarters at the beginning of the first shift. I prepared as one prepares for a medical procedure, with the specific, resigned calm of someone who understands that what is about to happen is necessary and unpleasant and outside their control. I dressed in clean robes. I ate a light meal. I recited the litany of sanctioned perception one final time, hearing the words as sounds, feeling their familiar rhythm pass through my mind without engaging my belief. Darvo's quarters had changed since my last visit. The writing desk was clear of data slates. In their place, a single parchment lay face down, sealed with the inquisitorial cipher. Two chairs faced each other across the desk. The room's only illumination came from a single luminator mounted above the desk, creating a cone of light that left the walls in shadow. He did not offer recaf this time. He asked me to sit. He asked me to describe, in my own words, without reference to doctrinal terminology, what I had perceived during the deep listening rite on the 312th day. I had expected accusation. I had expected theological interrogation. I had expected the carefully constructed questions designed to establish heretical deviation from approved doctrine. Instead, Darvo asked me to describe an experience. The distinction was significant. He was not asking me to defend a belief. He was asking me to report a perception. I described it. Not in the careful, doctrinally filtered language I had been using in my reports, but in the raw, unprocessed terminology of direct experience. I described the subsidence, the stillness, the geometric structures, the indifference. I described the navigator's death and the demonic interception and Marin Sulky's hollowing and the archive's misclassified records. I described the final descent and the revelation of scale. I described the Emperor's light failing to penetrate, not because it was opposed, but because the medium did not carry it. I spoke for approximately 40 minutes. Darvo listened without interruption. His expression did not change. His hands rested on the desk, fingers interlaced, perfectly still. When I finished, he asked me a single question. He asked me to define what I had perceived in one sentence. I said, "A structured substrate beneath the warp's active layer, predating all known warp phenomena, operating in total indifference to the surface, unreachable by the Astronomican, and rendering the ruinous powers superficial." Darvo nodded. He did not argue. He did not challenge my description. He did not accuse me of heresy or suggest demonic influence. He reached across the desk and turned over the sealed parchment. He broke the cipher seal and held the document so that I could read it. It was an order for sanctioned memory audit, countersigned by an inquisitorial authority whose name I did not recognize and whose jurisdiction, based on the cipher stamps, extended to the Ordo Hereticus. "This is not a punishment," Darvo said. "It is a precaution." I was escorted to the right chamber on the lower deck. The chamber was small, circular, its walls inscribed with hexagrammic wards that glowed faintly in the bioluminescent light. A restraint chair occupied the center, its straps and contact plates polished by use. Two Psychana adepts waited beside it, hooded figures whose psychic presence registered as controlled, precise, and entirely neutral. I sat in the chair. I did not resist. The straps secured my wrists and ankles and torso. The contact plates were pressed against my temples and the base of my skull. The adepts began their work. A memory audit is not a crude thing. It is not the violent psychic invasion of interrogation. It is meticulous, thorough, and almost gentle in its systematic disassembly of recollection. The adepts moved through my memories of the past 43 days with the careful attention of archivists examining fragile documents. They isolated each relevant memory, examined its structure, tested its coherence, and assessed its content for evidence of external influence. They found none. No demonic signature, no warp corruption, no evidence of psychic manipulation, compulsion, or deception. My memories were entirely self-generated, internally consistent, and untainted by any external intelligence. Everything I had perceived with my own faculties, operating within their designed parameters. That is what condemned me. I understood this as the adepts withdrew and the contact plates were removed from my skull. If my perceptions had been the result of demonic influence, the solution would be simple: exorcism, purification, and return to duty with appropriate monitoring. Demonic contamination was a known problem with known solutions. It fit within the Imperium's framework. It could be fought. But my perceptions were genuine. I had seen what was there. My faculties had functioned correctly. The deep warp was not a hallucination imposed by an enemy. It was a feature of reality that the Imperium's instruments were designed not to detect, and that its doctrine was designed not to describe. Darvo entered the right chamber after the adepts reported their findings. He carried a second parchment, and his expression held the particular careful neutrality of a man delivering a verdict he considers just but unpleasant. The Imperium, he explained, could not permit the concept of a warp layer beyond the reach of the Emperor's light to circulate among sanctioned psychers, not because the concept was necessarily false. He did not say it was false. He said it was destabilizing. The distinction was theological in the most literal sense. Theology exists to stabilize, and a truth that destabilizes is, by functional definition, heretical regardless of its accuracy. I was not being executed. I was not being declared heretic. I was being reassigned. My psychic aperture, the range of perception that defined the depth to which my awareness could extend into the immaterium, would be surgically reduced through sanctioned cranial excision. The procedure would permanently limit my capacity for deep perception, restricting my awareness to the navigable surface layer and eliminating the ability to perceive the substrate I had described. The modification was precise, reversible in theory but never in practice, and classified as a medical procedure rather than a punishment. The junior astropath, Marin Solki, would be rendered a servitor. Her hollowed psychic space would be repurposed as a signal amplification relay, her empty resonance chamber serving as a passive booster for the choir's harmonic output. She would continue to serve the Imperium. She would not be aware of doing so. The official record would state, "Warp instability event resolved. No further anomaly." The surgery was performed the following day. It was conducted in the ship's Medicae bay by a chirurgeon specialist who had clearly performed the procedure before, though he did not say so and I did not ask. The preparation was reverent. Incense burned in wall-mounted censers. A junior confessor recited the litany of sanctioned perception, and for the first time in weeks the words carried a significance I could feel, because they described the boundaries that were about to be carved into my flesh. I was given a local anesthetic that numbed the scalp and the outer layers of tissue but did not suppress psychic awareness. The procedure required me to be conscious, because the chirurgeon needed to monitor the reduction in real time, calibrating the excision to achieve the precise degree of limitation without damaging the faculties that remained authorized. The cutting was precise. I felt it not as pain but as diminishment, a closing of doors, a narrowing of corridors. The vast, heavy presence of the deep warp, which had lived at the periphery of my awareness for 43 days, began to recede, not suddenly, gradually, like a tide withdrawing. The geometric structures faded first, their compressed architecture dissolving from my perception like details lost in fog. Then the pressure eased, the immense weight of the substrate lifting from my awareness as the neural pathways that had carried its signal were methodically severed. The silence was the last thing to go, the deep, structural silence that had underscored every moment since the 312th day. It faded over the course of approximately 20 minutes as the chirurgeon worked with his micro-instruments and the junior confessor recited, and the incense curled through the sterile air. It faded, and the warp's surface noise expanded to fill the space it left, the screaming chaos resuming its position as the totality of my perceived Imperium. When the procedure was complete, the chirurgeon dressed the incision site and applied a biosynthetic seal that would integrate with the skull's surface over the following weeks. I was permitted to rest for 6 hours, then returned to duty. The world felt louder than it had before. The warp's surface, which I had come to perceive as shallow and performative, now filled my awareness with its full, uncontextualized fury. The daemons were terrifying again. The screaming was all there was. The Astronomicon blazed overhead with its golden authority, and I could not perceive anything below the layer where its light operated. Relief and grief coexisted in my chest like two liquids that would not mix. Relief because the weight was gone. The constant, crushing awareness of the abyss beneath reality had been lifted, and my mind felt lighter than it had in weeks. Grief because I knew the abyss was still there. The surgery had not removed the deep warp. It had removed my ability to perceive it. The distinction was enormous. I was a man who had been shown the foundation of reality and then had his eyes adjusted so that he could only see the ceiling. The ceiling was real. The ceiling was where I lived and worked and served. But the foundation was also real, and no surgical intervention could erase the memory of having perceived it. Fragments remained. The procedure had reduced my deep perception capacity, but memory operates through different neural architecture than active psychic perception. I retained impressions without clarity, a sense of pressure beneath the navigable surface, a memory of silence that no sound could fill, the knowledge, degraded to abstraction but persistent, that the screaming warp was a surface phenomenon resting on something incomprehensibly deeper. I could not perceive the deep warp. I could remember that it existed. The ship emerged from the Rift Shadow Lane on the 367th day, 19 days after my surgery. Translation to real space was marked by the customary observances: the Lord Captain's address, the confessor's Te Deum of safe passage, the choir's celebratory harmonic that I led with the restricted, narrowed perception that was now my permanent operational range. The Astronomicon burned steady and strong in the navigable layer, unobstructed by rift interference. Real space stars glittered through the observation ports. The void was cold and silent, and material and blessedly shallow in a way that brought me something close to peace. The pennants of St. Drusus docked at a supply station in the Nephilim subsector. Crew rotated, supplies were loaded. The choir underwent standard post-translation assessment, and my altered psychic signature was noted in the records with the clinical annotation, "Aperture reduction, sanctioned, medical reference attached." No further explanation, no contextual detail, a clean entry in a clean ledger. Maren Sulky was transferred to a Servitor processing facility. I signed the transfer order. Her name appeared on the form beside a classification number and a projected utility index. The numbers described her in terms of signal amplification capacity and estimated operational lifespan. She would serve the Imperium for approximately 30 more years before her biological systems degraded beyond maintenance threshold. I did not visit her before the transfer. There was nothing to visit. The person I had known was gone. What remained was infrastructure. The Imperium endured. The wars continued. Reports crossed my desk describing chaos incursions, demonic manifestations, warp storms, and psyker casualties in the same language they had always used, the language of a species fighting its reflection in a mirror, convinced that the reflection was the deepest truth of the universe. I resumed my duties with the discipline that 11 years of service had instilled, the litany of sanctioned perception, the monitoring cycles, the signal integrity reports, the calibration of the choir's harmonic output. Every task performed within the narrowed parameters of my reduced perception, every observation confined to the navigable surface of the warp, every report filed in doctrinally compliant language. I performed these duties well. My quarterly assessments reflected satisfactory performance. My reports were clean. My conduct was exemplary. I was, by every metric the Imperium possessed, a functioning and faithful servant of the Emperor. I no longer feared daemons. This was not courage. This was not defiance. This was the specific, quiet consequence of having perceived the hierarchy of the Imperium and understood that its terrors were organized in layers, and that the layer containing demons was not the deepest. The entities that battered the Geller field and howled in the warp's tides were real and dangerous, and capable of destroying ships and consuming souls, and I treated them with appropriate operational caution. But the primal, existential terror they had once inspired, the visceral dread of facing something vast and malevolent and fundamentally opposed to human existence, that terror had been replaced by a different one. I feared that the deep warp did not notice them. I feared that the screaming gods, the ruinous powers, the eternal adversaries of mankind, raged and plotted and warred across the surface of the Imperium in their endless contest of corruption and domination, and that beneath them the structured silence continued without awareness of their existence. I feared that Khorne's fury and Nurgle's despair and Tsench's scheming and Slanesh's hunger were noise generated by a thin layer of emotional turbulence on the surface of something that did not possess the capacity to hear noise. I feared irrelevance. Not my own irrelevance. I had accepted that on the 345th day, in the depth, when I perceived that the deep warp did not register my existence, my personal insignificance was a settled fact, absorbed and integrated into my continued function. I feared the irrelevance of everything. The Emperor, the Imperium, the Chaos Gods, 10,000 years of war, sacrifice, faith, heresy, corruption, and defiance, all of it conducted on a surface so thin that the substrate beneath it would not notice if the surface vanished entirely. Humanity could triumph or fall. The Imperium could endure or collapse. Chaos could consume every soul in the galaxy, and the deep warp would continue, unchanged, in its geometric silence, not because it chose to ignore these events, but because it lacked the capacity to perceive them. The deepest horror of the Imperium was not its malice, it was not the demons, it was not the Chaos Gods, it was not the madness or the corruption or the endless screaming fury of a dimension that fed on sentient suffering. The deepest horror was indifference, not chosen indifference, not the calculated disregard of an intelligence that has weighed humanity and found it wanting. Structural indifference, the indifference of scale, the indifference of a foundation that does not possess the architecture to register the existence of what rests upon it. I continued my service, I recited the litanies, I maintained the signal, I defended the ship against threats that I now understood were superficial, not because they lacked the power to destroy us, but because they existed in a layer of reality that was itself superficial relative to what lay beneath. I remained faithful, The word carried a different weight now. Faith had been my anchor, my purpose, my armor against the horrors of the warp. I had believed in the Emperor's light with the total, unquestioning commitment of a man who understood that his survival depended on the truth of that light. I still recited the words. I still performed the rites. I still maintained the structure of belief that the Imperium required of its sanctioned psychers. But faith is a communication. It is a signal sent upward, outward, towards something that the faithful believe receives it. The Emperor's light burns in the warp. The faithful direct their devotion toward that light. The light endures, and the faithful endure, and the relationship between signal and source gives meaning to both. My faith no longer believed it was seen. I sent the signal. I recited the litany. I directed my devotion toward the Astronomican's golden thread. And I knew, with the specific, irrevocable knowledge of a man who has perceived the architecture of the Imperium at a depth no doctrine described, that the signal reached the navigable surface and stopped there. It reached the layer where the Emperor's will maintained its corridor through chaos. It did not penetrate further. It could not. I was faithful. My faith operated within a bounded medium. Beneath that medium, in the structured silence of the deep warp, nothing received, nothing noticed. Nothing waited for my devotion or anyone's devotion, because waiting implies anticipation, and anticipation implies awareness, and awareness did not apply at that depth. I served, I complied, I performed, I endured. Somewhere beneath the screaming tides, beneath the gods and their wars, beneath the Emperor's light and the Astronomican's golden thread, beneath everything that humanity had ever known or feared or worshipped in the Imperium, the vast and patient architecture continued its incomprehensible existence. It did not wait for us. It did not wait for anything. It simply continued, as it had before we existed, as it would after we were gone, in a silence so complete that the concept of sound had never applied to it. Humanity screams upon a surface no one below has ever needed to notice.